The sound of Marcus Henderson's condescending laughter echoed through the conference room as he dismissed my quarterly report with a wave of his hand. But what he didn't know was that every stock option he bragged about, every bonus he anticipated, every promotion he was gunning for, was controlled by a signature that belonged to me. His voice carried that familiar tone of superiority as he addressed the rest of the team, completely ignoring the months of research and analysis I'd poured into the presentation he'd just torn apart in front of everyone. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. What Marcus and the entire senior management team didn't realize was that the quiet junior analyst they'd been overlooking and undermining for the past 18 months was actually the majority shareholder of the very company that employed them all. My name is Sarah Chen, and I've always been the type of person who prefers substance over flash, results over recognition. At 26, I've learned that sometimes the most powerful people in a room are the ones nobody pays attention to, the ones who sit quietly in the back taking notes while others fight for the spotlight. It's not that I lack confidence in my abilities, quite the opposite actually, but I've discovered that there's a certain strategic advantage to being underestimated, to letting people reveal their true character when they think there are no consequences for their actions. Working at Meridian Financial Services as what everyone believed was a junior financial analyst wasn't technically a lie, though it wasn't the complete picture either. I did analyze financial data and market trends, I did prepare reports and conduct research, and I did attend meetings where my input was routinely dismissed or credited to someone else. What my colleagues didn't know was that I wasn't just analyzing Meridian's financial performance for some distant senior executive. I was monitoring the health and direction of a company that I had inherited controlling interest in when my grandfather passed away 2 years ago. The inheritance had been as unexpected as it was substantial. My grandfather, Chen Wei-ming, had built Meridian Financial from a small investment advisory firm in the 1980s into one of the most respected financial services companies on the West Coast. He'd been a brilliant businessman with an instinct for identifying undervalued opportunities and the patience to wait for long-term gains, rather than chasing quick profits. When he died suddenly of a heart attack, most people assumed his shares would be distributed among several family members or sold to the highest bidder. Nobody expected him to leave 68% of the company to his granddaughter, who had just graduated with an MBA and was known more for her academic achievements than her business connections. The decision to work at Meridian under my maiden name rather than immediately announcing my ownership had been deliberate and strategic. I wanted to understand the company from the ground up, to see how it really operated when the owner wasn't watching, to identify the strengths and weaknesses in management that might not be apparent from boardroom presentations and quarterly reports. I wanted to know which employees were genuinely contributing to the company's success and which ones were coasting on reputation or political connections. Most importantly, I wanted to see how people treated someone they perceived as powerless, because I believed that revealed their true character more than any interview or performance review ever could. What I discovered during my 18 months of observation was both enlightening and deeply troubling. Meridian was profitable and growing, which was good news for the inheritance I was depending on to secure my financial future. The company's investment strategies were sound, our client retention rates were excellent, and our reputation in the industry remained strong. However, the internal culture was toxic in ways that would eventually undermine all of those positive factors if left unchecked. There was rampant favoritism in promotions and project assignments, systematic discrimination against women and younger employees, and a management style that prioritized politics over performance. Marcus Henderson embodied everything that was wrong with Meridian's leadership culture. At 38, he'd been with the company for 6 years and had worked his way up to Director of Strategic Analysis through a combination of aggressive self-promotion, strategic alliance building with senior executives, and an uncanny ability to take credit for other people's work while deflecting blame for his own mistakes. He was the kind of manager who spoke confidently about subjects he didn't fully understand, who made decisions based on gut feelings rather than data analysis, and who treated subordinates as either useful tools or obstacles to be removed. From my first day in Marcus's department, it was clear that he viewed me as someone who didn't belong in the world of high-stakes financial analysis. During my initial meeting with him, he'd looked over my resume with barely concealed skepticism, focusing more on my age and gender than on my educational background or internship experience. He'd made several comments about the team being a challenging environment for someone without extensive industry experience, implying that I might be more comfortable in a support role rather than doing actual analysis work. When I'd mentioned my graduate degree from Wharton, he'd dismissed it with a comment about academic theory being different from real-world application, as if my education was somehow a liability rather than an asset. The pattern of dismissal and undermining had started immediately, and only gotten worse over time. Marcus would assign me to projects that were either impossibly complex for a single person to complete in the given time frame, or so mundane that they offered no opportunity to demonstrate analytical skills or strategic thinking. When I managed to exceed expectations on the challenging assignments, he would minimize my contributions in team meetings or suggest that I'd had help from more experienced colleagues. When I completed the mundane tasks efficiently and thoroughly, he would criticize me for not showing enough initiative or creativity in my approach. The most frustrating aspect of working under Marcus was watching him take credit for insights and recommendations that had originated from my research. I would spend weeks analyzing market trends, interviewing industry experts, and modeling different scenarios, only to watch him present my findings to senior management as if they were his own original thoughts. He had a talent for reframing my detailed analysis into broad strategic observations that made him look visionary while reducing my work to simple data collection. When the recommendations proved successful, Marcus received the recognition and career advancement opportunities. When they didn't work out as expected, somehow the blame would trace back to flawed analysis or insufficient research from his team. The other analysts in the department had learned to accept this dynamic as the price of working in a competitive industry. They kept their heads down, did their assigned work, and hoped that eventually their competence would be recognized and rewarded. Some of them had been with the company for years, gradually becoming resigned to the fact that advancement would depend more on Marcus's favor than on actual performance. They'd seen talented colleagues leave for better opportunities at other firms, and they'd watched less qualified but more politically savvy employees get promoted over them. The culture of acceptance and resignation was so entrenched that even discussing Marcus's unfair treatment felt risky, as if complaining might mark someone as not being a team player. But I wasn't just another analyst hoping for eventual recognition. I was the owner of the company, and I was watching an incompetent manager systematically undermine the morale and productivity of an entire department, while taking credit for work that he hadn't done and couldn't replicate. Every unfair assignment, every dismissed contribution, every instance of stolen credit was happening in a company that I had the power to change immediately, if I chose to reveal my identity. The question was whether I had seen enough to make informed decisions about personnel changes, or whether I needed to continue my undercover assessment to fully understand the scope of the problems. The project that would ultimately force my hand was a comprehensive analysis of emerging markets in Southeast Asia that Marcus had pitched to the executive committee as a potential new focus area for the company's international investment division. The proposal had been well received by senior management, who saw it as an opportunity to diversify Meridian's portfolio and tap into rapidly growing economies that were attracting increasing attention from global investors. Marcus had been given a budget of $200,000 and a timeline of 6 months to produce a detailed feasibility study that would inform the company's strategic planning for the next 5 years. What the executive committee didn't know was that the Southeast Asia proposal had originated entirely from a research paper I'd written during my final semester at Wharton, a paper that had explored the investment potential of emerging markets in Vietnam, Thailand, and Indonesia, based on demographic trends, regulatory changes, and infrastructure development patterns. I'd shared the paper with Marcus during one of our departmental meetings, thinking it might provide useful background information for the team's broader research initiatives. Instead, he'd taken my academic work, repackaged it with some superficial modifications, and presented it as his own strategic insight to secure the largest research budget our department had received in years. The irony of the situation wasn't lost on me. I was being asked to conduct research to support a proposal that was based on my own original work, research that would be credited to the manager who had stolen my ideas in the first place. Marcus assigned me to lead the data collection and preliminary analysis phases of the project, which he described as grunt work, that would give me valuable experience in international market research. He would handle the strategic assessment and client presentation phases, which he characterized as requiring senior-level expertise and industry relationships that I hadn't yet developed. I threw myself into the Southeast Asia project with an intensity that surprised even me. This wasn't just about proving my analytical capabilities or demonstrating my value to the company. This was about creating a body of work so comprehensive and insightful that Marcus's inability to truly understand or defend it would become obvious to anyone who looked closely. I spent 12-hour days analyzing economic data, conducting phone interviews with local business leaders, and building financial models that projected investment returns under various market scenarios. I reached out to former classmates who were working in the region, contacted professors who specialized in emerging market economics, and even arranged virtual meetings with government officials who could provide insights into regulatory trends and policy directions. The research I produced over the course of 4 months was, without false modesty, exceptional. I'd identified specific investment opportunities that other analysis firms had missed, documented regulatory changes that would impact foreign investment in ways that hadn't been widely reported, and developed risk assessment frameworks that accounted for political and economic variables that were unique to each country we were evaluating. The report was detailed enough to serve as a roadmap for actual investment decisions, but also strategic enough to provide broader insights into how Meridian could position itself in emerging markets more generally. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Marcus's response to my work was predictably frustrating. He praised the thoroughness of my research while criticizing what he called my lack of strategic thinking and big-picture perspective. He suggested that I was too focused on details and data points, rather than identifying the broader trends and opportunities that would matter to senior executives and major clients. During our team meetings, he would ask me to present specific findings from my research, then interrupt with observations about how the information could be interpreted differently or framed more strategically. He positioned himself as the experienced manager who could translate raw analysis into actionable business insights, while positioning me as a diligent but junior-level researcher who needed guidance to understand the implications of her own work. The breaking point came during the presentation preparation phase, when Marcus informed me that my name would not appear anywhere in the materials being presented to the executive committee. He explained that this was standard practice for team-based projects, where individual contributions were rolled up into a comprehensive report that represented the department's collective analysis. He suggested that receiving credit for contributing to such a high-profile project would be valuable for my professional development, even if my specific contributions weren't explicitly acknowledged. The implication was that I should be grateful for the opportunity to support such important work, regardless of whether I received recognition for my role in producing it. What made Marcus's decision particularly galling was his simultaneous announcement that he would be presenting the project findings at the annual industry conference in San Francisco, a presentation that would significantly raise his profile within the financial services community and likely lead to speaking opportunities and consulting offers. The conference presentation would be based entirely on research that I had conducted, insights that I had developed, and recommendations that I had formulated, but Marcus would receive all the professional benefits that came from being associated with innovative and successful analysis. I spent that evening sitting in my small apartment, staring at the stack of research reports and financial models that represented 4 months of intensive work, feeling a familiar mixture of frustration and disbelief at Marcus's casual theft of my professional efforts. But this time, the feeling was accompanied by something else, a growing sense of clarity about what I needed to do. I wasn't just Sarah Chen, junior analyst who had to accept unfair treatment because she needed the job and the experience. I was Sarah Chen, majority shareholder of Meridian Financial Services, and I had both the power and the responsibility to address systematic problems in the company's management culture. The decision to reveal my identity wasn't one I made lightly. For 18 months, I'd been gathering information and building relationships based on the assumption that my colleagues saw me as an equal rather than as their ultimate boss. Once they knew who I really was, every interaction would be filtered through the knowledge of my ownership position, and I would lose the ability to observe how the company really functioned when nobody thought the owner was watching. There would be no going back to being the quiet analyst in the corner once I stepped forward as the person who controlled everyone's employment and advancement opportunities. But Marcus's theft of my Southeast Asia research had clarified something important for me. I hadn't been observing objectively from a position of powerlessness. I'd been allowing systematic unfairness to continue when I had the authority to stop it immediately. Every day that I remained silent about my identity was another day that Marcus could take credit for work he hadn't done. Another day that talented employees could be overlooked for advancement opportunities they deserved. Another day that the company's culture could continue prioritizing politics over performance. My grandfather hadn't built Meridian Financial to be a place where incompetent managers prospered while hardworking employees were marginalized. And I had a responsibility to honor his legacy by ensuring the company operated according to values that he would have endorsed. The plan I developed for revealing my identity was strategic rather than purely confrontational. I wanted Marcus and the rest of the management team to understand not just that they had been wrong about me, but that their behavior had real consequences for both the people they managed and the overall success of the company. I wanted to create a situation where the contrast between their assumptions and reality would be so stark that denial or rationalization would be impossible. Most importantly, I wanted to use the moment of revelation to begin implementing changes that would prevent future employees from experiencing the kind of systematic undermining that I had been documenting for the past 18 months. I started by scheduling individual meetings with key employees in Marcus's department, ostensibly to gather their input on potential improvements to our research processes and project management systems. These conversations were revealing in ways that went beyond what I had observed during my time as a regular team member. When people believed they were talking to a sympathetic colleague, rather than someone with authority to make changes, they were much more honest about their frustrations with management, their concerns about fairness in project assignments and recognition, and their thoughts about what changes would improve both morale and productivity. Almost every conversation included unprompted criticism of Marcus's leadership style and specific examples of how his behavior had negatively impacted both individual career development and team performance. Several employees mentioned projects where their contributions had been minimized or ignored entirely, situations where Marcus had taken credit for ideas that had originated from team members, and instances where he had blamed his subordinates for problems that resulted from his own poor decision-making or inadequate planning. The pattern of behavior that I had experienced personally was clearly much more widespread than I had initially realized, and the impact on department morale and efficiency was more severe than even I had understood. Armed with this additional information about Marcus's systematic mistreatment of his team, I felt even more confident that revealing my identity and making immediate changes to the department's leadership structure would benefit not just me personally, but the company as a whole. Marcus wasn't just stealing credit from me. He was creating an environment where talented people were consistently undervalued, and their contributions were systematically minimized. The cost to Meridian wasn't just the loss of good employees who left for better opportunities elsewhere. It was the missed innovations and insights that came from having a demoralized and disengaged workforce. The final step in my preparation was arranging a meeting with James Morrison, Meridian's chief executive officer, who had been running the company's day-to-day operations since my grandfather's death 2 years earlier. James had been my grandfather's protege and closest advisor, someone who understood both the company's history and its strategic direction better than anyone else in the organization. He was also one of the few people who knew about my inheritance, and had been respectfully waiting for me to decide how and when I wanted to become more actively involved in the company's management. Our meeting took place on a Friday afternoon in James's corner office. With its floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the San Francisco Bay and walls lined with awards and recognition that Meridian had received over its decades of operation. James was in his early 50s, with the kind of understated confidence that came from years of successful leadership in a competitive industry. He'd been supportive of my decision to work in the company anonymously, understanding my desire to learn the business from the ground up, rather than stepping immediately into an ownership role based solely on inheritance. I spent over an hour detailing my observations about Marcus's department, sharing specific examples of his poor leadership and the impact it was having on both employee morale and work quality. I showed James some of the research I had produced for the Southeast Asia project, explaining how Marcus was planning to present it as his own work at the upcoming industry conference. I provided documentation of other instances where Marcus had taken credit for subordinates' contributions, and I shared feedback from other team members about their experiences working under his management. James listened carefully to everything I had to say, taking notes and asking thoughtful questions about specific incidents and patterns of behavior. He wasn't surprised by the information I was sharing, which suggested that Marcus's problems as a manager were known to senior leadership, even if they hadn't been directly addressed. When I finished my presentation, James was quiet for several minutes, clearly considering the implications of what I had told him and thinking through the best approach for addressing the situation. "Sarah," James said finally, "I want you to know that your grandfather would be proud of how you've handled this situation. Taking the time to really understand the company and identify problems that need to be addressed shows exactly the kind of thoughtful leadership that built Meridian in the first place. You could have walked in here 2 years ago and started making changes based on assumptions, but instead you did the hard work of gathering real information about how the company actually operates." James continued by explaining that Marcus's performance issues had been a concern for senior management for some time, but that they hadn't had concrete evidence of the specific problems I was documenting. Marcus was skilled at managing upward, presenting himself well to executives while creating problems for the people who reported to him. The fact that I had detailed documentation of his behavior patterns, combined with feedback from other team members, would make it much easier to address the situation decisively, rather than simply providing additional training or supervision that might not solve the underlying problems. We spent another hour discussing potential approaches for revealing my identity and implementing changes to the department's structure. James suggested that the upcoming presentation of the Southeast Asia research would provide an ideal opportunity to make my ownership position known, while simultaneously addressing the issue of Marcus taking credit for work he hadn't done. The presentation was scheduled for the following Thursday in front of the entire executive committee, which would ensure that my revelation had maximum impact and that the changes we implemented would be clearly supported by senior leadership. The plan we developed was elegant in its simplicity. I would attend the executive committee meeting as the lead researcher on the Southeast Asia project, introduced by James as someone who had been doing exceptional work and deserved recognition for her contributions to what he anticipated would be a groundbreaking analysis. Marcus would be invited to present his strategic recommendations based on the research, giving him an opportunity to take credit for work he hadn't done in front of the people whose opinions mattered most for his career advancement. Then, at the conclusion of his presentation, James would ask me to provide additional context about the research methodology and findings, creating a natural opportunity for me to demonstrate my deep understanding of work that Marcus was claiming as his own. The moment of revelation would come when James introduced me not just as the lead researcher on the project, but as Sarah Chen, granddaughter of the company's founder and majority shareholder of Meridian Financial Services. The use of my full name would make the family connection clear to everyone in the room, while the timing of the announcement would create an unmistakable contrast between Marcus's attempts to take credit for my work and the reality of who had actually produced the analysis he was presenting. I spent the weekend before the executive committee meeting, reviewing every detail of my Southeast Asia research, preparing for the questions I would inevitably be asked once my identity was revealed. I practiced explaining complex economic concepts in clear, accessible language, anticipating that some of the executives would want to test my knowledge to satisfy themselves that I truly understood the work I was claiming credit for. I prepared responses to likely questions about my decision to work anonymously and my plans for future involvement in the company's management. Most importantly, I mentally prepared myself for the moment when 18 months of careful observation and strategic patience would culminate in a confrontation that would change my relationship with Meridian Financial forever. The nervousness I felt wasn't about my ability to defend my research or explain my analysis, areas where I was completely confident in my expertise and preparation. The nervousness was about stepping out of the protective anonymity that had allowed me to observe and learn without the complications that came with being known as the boss. Once the executive committee knew who I really was, every interaction with employees would be different, every decision I made would be scrutinized for signs of favoritism or inexperience, and every mistake I made would be magnified by the knowledge that I hadn't earned my position through traditional career advancement. But Marcus's systematic theft of my work had made it clear that remaining anonymous was no longer serving the company's best interests or my own development as a leader. If I was going to honor my grandfather's legacy and build on the foundation he had created, I needed to step forward and take responsibility for ensuring that Meridian operated according to the values of fairness, competence, and integrity that had made it successful in the first place. The confrontation with Marcus would be just the beginning of a longer process of establishing my authority and implementing changes that would benefit both employees and clients. Thursday morning arrived gray and overcast, with the kind of San Francisco fog that made the city feel muted and introspective. I dressed carefully for the executive committee meeting, choosing a navy blue suit that projected confidence without being ostentatious, accessories that were professional but not intimidating. I wanted to look like someone who belonged in a senior leadership discussion, but I also wanted my appearance to be consistent with the modest, understated image I had cultivated during my time as a junior analyst. The goal was to let my knowledge and competence speak for themselves, rather than relying on external symbols of authority or status. The executive committee meeting was held in Meridian's largest conference room, a space designed to impress both employees and clients with its panoramic views of the Bay and its state-of-the-art presentation technology. As I walked into the room, carrying my research materials, I could see Marcus near the front, reviewing his presentation notes with the kind of nervous energy that suggested he was feeling the pressure of making a good impression on senior management. He glanced up briefly as I entered, nodding in my direction with the casual acknowledgement he typically gave to subordinates whose presence was expected but not particularly important. The irony of his dismissive attitude wasn't lost on me. In less than an hour, Marcus would discover that the junior analyst he'd been systematically undermining and taking credit from was actually the person who controlled his employment, his advancement opportunities, and his stock options. The thought sent a mixture of anticipation and determination through me as I took my seat at the conference table, preparing for a confrontation that had been 18 months in the making. The other executives began filing into the conference room precisely at 9 o'clock, each carrying their own folders and tablets, while exchanging the kind of polite, professional conversation that preceded important meetings. I recognized most of them from company newsletters and annual reports, though this would be my first time interacting with them in any meaningful way. There was Patricia Williams, the Chief Operating Officer who had been instrumental in expanding Meridian's client base over the past 5 years. David Kim sat across from her, our Chief Technology Officer who had modernized the company's analytical capabilities and data management systems. Next to him was Robert Chen, no relation despite the shared surname, who served as our Chief Financial Officer and had been managing the company's impressive growth in assets under management. James Morrison entered last, carrying himself with the quiet authority that had made him such an effective leader during the transition period following my grandfather's death. He took his seat at the head of the conference table and opened the meeting with brief comments about the importance of the Southeast Asia analysis for Meridian's strategic planning. His introduction of the project was carefully neutral, explaining that the research had been conducted by our strategic analysis department under Marcus's direction, but noting that the findings would be presented jointly to ensure that both strategic insights and detailed analytical work received appropriate attention. Marcus stood to begin his presentation, and I could see the confidence radiating from him as he prepared to showcase what he believed would be his ticket to senior management recognition. He had dressed more formally than usual for the occasion, wearing an expensive suit that projected success and ambition. His opening remarks focused on his vision for expanding Meridian's international presence, describing the Southeast Asia opportunity as something he had identified through his extensive industry contacts and strategic thinking about global market trends. He spoke with the kind of authoritative tone that suggested deep expertise, throwing around financial terminology and market analysis concepts with practiced ease. As Marcus continued his presentation, systematically taking credit for insights and recommendations that had emerged from my months of research, I found myself studying the faces of the executive committee members. They were clearly impressed by what they were hearing, nodding along with his strategic observations, and asking thoughtful questions about implementation timelines and resource requirements. Patricia Williams seemed particularly engaged, asking detailed questions about regulatory environments and political risk factors that Marcus answered with confidence, drawing directly from the briefing materials I had prepared for him. The most frustrating aspect of watching Marcus present my work was seeing how effortlessly he had absorbed and repackaged my analysis without truly understanding the underlying methodology or reasoning. When David Kim asked about the data sources used to assess market volatility in Vietnam, Marcus provided a superficial answer that hit the main points but lacked the nuanced understanding that came from actually conducting the research. When Robert Chen inquired about currency hedging strategies for investments in the region, Marcus's response was technically correct but missed several important considerations that I had identified during my analysis of exchange rate patterns and central bank policies. What became increasingly clear as the presentation progressed was that Marcus had memorized my conclusions without internalizing the analytical framework that had led to those conclusions. He could recite my findings and recommendations with impressive confidence, but he couldn't engage in the kind of substantive discussion that would demonstrate real expertise in emerging market analysis. Several times during the question and answer period, I noticed him glancing in my direction when faced with particularly technical questions, as if expecting me to provide some kind of subtle guidance or support. The irony of the situation was almost overwhelming. Here was Marcus, presenting my research to senior executives as evidence of his strategic vision and analytical capabilities, while I sat quietly taking notes like a dutiful subordinate whose role was to support his success. The executives were praising insights that had come from my mind, discussing implementation strategies based on my recommendations, and considering budget allocations for initiatives that I had conceptualized and developed. Yet Marcus was receiving all the recognition and career advancement opportunities that should have accompanied such innovative work. When Marcus concluded his formal presentation, James opened the floor for additional questions and discussion. This was the moment we had planned for, when I would be invited to provide additional context about the research methodology and findings. I could feel my heart rate increasing as James turned toward me with what appeared to be a casual question about data collection procedures, but which I knew was actually the beginning of our carefully orchestrated revelation sequence. Sarah has been leading the analytical work on this project, James said, addressing the room while maintaining eye contact with me. I think it would be valuable to hear directly from her about some of the more technical aspects of the research, particularly the methodology used to assess investment risk factors and the process for validating economic projections in emerging markets. I stood slowly, gathering my research materials and moving to the front of the room where Marcus had been presenting just moments before. I could see surprise and slight annoyance flash across his face at this unexpected development. In his mind, I was supposed to remain in the background, providing support if needed but not taking center stage during such an important presentation. The idea that I might have something substantive to contribute to the discussion clearly hadn't occurred to him, despite the fact that he was presenting research I had conducted entirely on my own. My approach to presenting the technical details of the Southeast Asia analysis was deliberately different from Marcus's strategic overview. Where he had focused on broad market opportunities and high-level recommendations, I dove deep into the analytical methodology that had produced those insights. I explained the specific economic indicators I had tracked across different countries, the statistical models I had used to project investment returns under various scenarios, and the risk assessment frameworks I had developed to account for political and regulatory variables that were unique to each market we had evaluated. The questions that followed my presentation were more detailed and technically sophisticated than the ones Marcus had fielded during his overview. Patricia Williams wanted to understand how I had weighted different risk factors in my overall assessment model. David Kim was interested in the technology tools and data sources I had used to gather real-time information about regulatory changes and policy developments. Robert Chen asked about the sensitivity analysis I had conducted to test how different economic assumptions would impact investment projections. What became immediately apparent to everyone in the room was that I possessed a level of detailed knowledge about the research that went far beyond what would be expected from someone who had simply provided analytical support for someone else's project. I could discuss every aspect of the methodology with confidence because I had developed it myself. I could explain the reasoning behind specific analytical choices, because I had made those choices based on my own assessment of what would produce the most accurate and useful results. I could respond to technical questions with the kind of substantive depth that only came from having actually conducted the research rather than simply reviewing someone else's findings. The contrast between my detailed, technically sophisticated responses and Marcus's earlier superficial answers was stark enough that I could see the executive committee members beginning to reassess their understanding of how the project had actually been conducted. Several of them exchanged glances that suggested they were wondering why the person with the deepest knowledge of the research hadn't been the one presenting the strategic recommendations. Patricia Williams asked a particularly pointed question about whether I had been responsible for developing the investment recommendations that Marcus had presented, or whether my role had been limited to data collection and preliminary analysis. This was the opening I had been waiting for, the moment when I could begin to reveal the true nature of my contributions to the project without appearing to undermine Marcus directly. I explained that I had been responsible for all phases of the research, from initial market identification through final investment recommendations. I detailed the process I had used to identify specific opportunities that other analysis firms had missed, and I described the strategic framework I had developed for evaluating how Meridian could position itself most effectively in emerging markets more generally. As I continued to demonstrate my comprehensive understanding of every aspect of the Southeast Asia analysis, I could see Marcus becoming increasingly uncomfortable. He was beginning to realize that his attempt to take credit for my work was backfiring spectacularly. Instead of showcasing his strategic vision and analytical capabilities, the meeting was revealing that he had essentially no understanding of the research he had been presenting as his own. The executives were directing all of their substantive questions to me rather than to him, and his role was being reduced to that of a bystander in a discussion about work he was supposed to have led. James Morrison allowed the technical discussion to continue for nearly 30 minutes, giving me ample opportunity to demonstrate the depth and sophistication of my analysis while subtly highlighting the gaps in Marcus's understanding. Then, as we had planned, he moved to the final phase of our revelation strategy. He thanked me for the comprehensive overview of the research methodology and noted that the quality of the analysis was exceptional, representing exactly the kind of innovative thinking that had made Meridian successful over the decades. Before we conclude today's discussion, James said, looking around the conference table at his fellow executives, "I think there's something important that all of you should know about Sarah and her connection to this company." He paused for a moment, allowing the anticipation to build in the room. "Sarah, would you mind sharing with the committee your full name and your relationship to Meridian's founder?" This was the moment I had been preparing for, the culmination of 18 months of careful observation and strategic patience. I looked around the conference table at the faces of senior executives who had known my grandfather and respected his vision for the company. Some of them were clearly puzzled by James's question, wondering what my name or family background could possibly have to do with the Southeast Asia Research Project. Others seemed to be beginning to suspect that there was more to my presence at Meridian than they had previously understood. "My name is Sarah Chen, I said clearly, making sure that every word was audible to everyone in the room. Chen Wei-ming was my grandfather, the founder of Meridian Financial Services. When he passed away 2 years ago, he left me controlling ownership of the company, making me the majority shareholder and ultimate decision-maker for all strategic and personnel matters." The silence that followed my announcement was profound and electric. I watched as the implications of what I had just revealed sank in for each of the executive committee members. Patricia Williams's mouth had fallen open slightly, her eyes widening as she processed the information. David Kim was staring at me as if he had never seen me before, clearly trying to reconcile the junior analyst he thought he knew with the owner of the company. Robert Chen was shaking his head slowly, a smile beginning to form on his face as he realized the elegant way that my identity had been concealed and then revealed. But it was Marcus's reaction that provided the most satisfaction. The color had drained from his face completely, and he was gripping the edge of the conference table as if he needed physical support to remain standing. His eyes were darting between me and James Morrison, clearly trying to understand how this revelation had come to pass and what it meant for his own position at the company. The confident, self-assured manager who had been taking credit for my work just minutes earlier had been replaced by someone who looked like he was contemplating the end of his career. James allowed the silence to continue for several seconds, giving everyone time to fully absorb the significance of what they had just learned. Then he continued with the explanation we had prepared, describing my decision to work at the company anonymously in order to understand its operations from the ground up. He praised my commitment to learning the business thoroughly before taking on ownership responsibilities, and he noted that the Southeast Asia research was just one example of the exceptional work I had been producing during my time in the strategic analysis department. The executive committee members began asking questions about my background, my plans for the company, and my experience working in Marcus's department. I answered honestly about my educational preparation for taking on ownership responsibilities, explaining that my MBA from Wharton had included extensive coursework in emerging market analysis and international finance. I described my decision to work anonymously as stemming from a desire to understand the company's culture and operations objectively, without the complications that would have come from being known as the owner from the beginning. When Patricia Williams asked about my experience working under Marcus's management, I chose my words carefully. I explained that the experience had been educational in ways that went beyond technical skill development, giving me insights into management styles and departmental dynamics that would inform my future decisions about company leadership. I noted that I had observed both strengths and areas for improvement in how the strategic analysis department operated, and that I planned to use these observations to make changes that would benefit both employees and clients. Marcus finally found his voice and attempted to salvage something from the situation. He congratulated me on the revelation and claimed that he had always recognized my exceptional analytical abilities, even if he hadn't known about my family connection to the company. He suggested that his role as department director had been to provide guidance and support for my development, helping me to translate academic knowledge into practical business applications. He attempted to reframe his theft of my work as mentorship, claiming that he had been giving me opportunities to contribute to high-profile projects that would accelerate my professional growth. The attempt at revisionist history was so transparent and self-serving that it actually made his situation worse rather than better. Everyone in the room had just witnessed him presenting my research as his own original work, and they had seen the dramatic difference between his superficial understanding and my comprehensive knowledge of every detail. His claim that he had been mentoring me and facilitating my contributions was directly contradicted by what they had observed during the presentation and discussion. James Morrison addressed Marcus's comments with diplomatic but unmistakable firmness. He noted that the presentation had made it clear that Sarah had been responsible for all substantive aspects of the Southeast Asia research, and that her analytical capabilities were obviously exceptional regardless of any guidance she might have received. He suggested that the company would benefit from ensuring that credit for excellent work was appropriately assigned to the people who had actually produced it, and that management practices should focus on developing talent rather than obscuring individual contributions. David Kim asked a question that cut directly to the heart of the matter. Given Sarah's obvious expertise and comprehensive understanding of the research, he wondered, why hadn't she been the one presenting the strategic recommendations to the executive committee in the first place? Why had the presentation been structured as if Marcus had been responsible for the analytical work, when it was clear that Sarah had conducted all aspects of the research independently? The question hung in the air like an accusation, and I could see Marcus struggling to formulate a response that wouldn't further damage his credibility. Any explanation he offered would essentially amount to admitting that he had deliberately taken credit for work he hadn't done, or that he had failed to recognize the exceptional quality of my contributions and had therefore misrepresented the project's leadership structure to senior management. Either admission would be professionally devastating for someone in his position. I decided to spare Marcus the embarrassment of attempting to answer David's question, while also making it clear that I understood exactly what had transpired. I explained that as a relatively new employee, I had been following standard departmental procedures for project reporting and presentation. I noted that I was grateful for the opportunity to share my research directly with the executive committee, and that I looked forward to future projects where my contributions could be more clearly recognized and appropriately credited. The diplomatic way I handled Marcus's obvious attempt to steal credit for my work seemed to impress the executive committee members, who could see that I was choosing to be gracious rather than vindictive, despite having clear grounds for complaint. Patricia Williams commented that my mature approach to a difficult situation spoke well of my leadership potential, and suggested that I would be an asset to the company's senior management team when I decided to take on a more active ownership role. Robert Chen asked about my plans for future involvement in company operations, wondering whether I intended to continue working in an analytical capacity or whether I planned to transition into more traditional ownership and executive responsibilities. This was a question I had anticipated, and I had prepared a thoughtful response that would signal my intentions without committing to specific timelines or organizational changes. I explained that I valued the analytical experience I had gained working in Marcus's department, and that I believed understanding the company's operations at a detailed level would make me a more effective owner and strategic decision-maker. I noted that I planned to continue being actively involved in research and analysis, though I would also be taking on broader responsibilities for strategic planning and organizational development. I mentioned that I had observed opportunities for improving both operational efficiency and employee development, and that I looked forward to working with the executive team to implement changes that would benefit everyone at Meridian. The mention of operational improvements and organizational development was clearly understood by everyone in the room as a reference to the management problems that had been revealed during the meeting. Marcus's attempt to take credit for my work had illustrated exactly the kind of leadership failure that could undermine employee morale and company performance. The executive committee members could see that I had direct experience with poor management practices, and that I would be motivated to address these issues from an informed perspective rather than based on theoretical knowledge or secondhand reports. James Morrison suggested that we schedule follow-up meetings to discuss implementation strategies for the Southeast Asia recommendations and to begin planning for my transition into a more active ownership role. He noted that the research I had conducted was exceptional by any standard, and that the investment opportunities I had identified deserved serious consideration for inclusion in Meridian's portfolio. He also mentioned that the company would benefit from my continued involvement in emerging market analysis, given the obvious expertise I had developed in this area. As the meeting began to wind down, Patricia Williams asked one final question that seemed designed to put Marcus on notice about his future behavior. She wondered whether the Strategic Analysis Department had other projects in development that might benefit from similar direct input from the researchers who had conducted the analytical work. She suggested that the company might want to review its standard procedures for project presentation and credit assignment to ensure that excellent work was being appropriately recognized and that talented employees were receiving the visibility they deserved. The message was unmistakable. Marcus's practice of taking credit for subordinates' work had been exposed and would not be tolerated going forward. The executive committee now understood that the quiet junior analyst they had never paid attention to was actually the owner of the company, and that her exceptional analytical work had been systematically undervalued and misattributed. Any future attempts by Marcus to repeat this pattern of behavior would be viewed as a serious management failure that could jeopardize his position at the company. Marcus mumbled something about reviewing departmental procedures and ensuring that all team members received appropriate recognition for their contributions. His confident demeanor from the beginning of the meeting had been completely replaced by nervous defensiveness, and it was clear that he understood the precarious position he now found himself in. The manager, who had walked into the conference room expecting to receive praise and career advancement opportunities, was leaving with his competence questioned and his future at the company in doubt. After the other executives had left the conference room, James Morrison asked me to stay behind for a private conversation about next steps. He wanted to discuss my plans for transitioning into active ownership responsibilities and my thoughts about addressing the management issues that had been revealed during the meeting. He also wanted to talk about the practical aspects of my continuing work at the company, including whether I planned to maintain my current position in the Strategic Analysis Department, or move into a different role that better reflected my ownership status. The conversation with James was productive and encouraging. He had been impressed not only by the quality of my analytical work, but also by my mature handling of Marcus's attempt to steal credit for my research. He noted that my decision to work anonymously had provided valuable insights into the company's operations and management culture, and that I was now well positioned to make informed decisions about organizational improvements. He suggested that my grandfather would have been proud of the thorough approach I had taken to understanding the business before asserting my ownership authority. We discussed potential changes to the Strategic Analysis Department structure, including the possibility of promoting some of the talented analysts who had been working under Marcus's poor leadership. James shared his own observations about Marcus's management style and confirmed that senior leadership had been concerned about his impact on department morale and productivity. He noted that my revelation had provided an opportunity to address these issues decisively, rather than continuing to hope that additional training or supervision might solve the underlying problems. When I left the conference room that afternoon, I felt a profound sense of relief and anticipation. After 18 months of careful observation and strategic patience, I had finally revealed my true identity and begun the process of taking active responsibility for the company my grandfather had built. The confrontation with Marcus had gone exactly as James and I had planned, exposing his incompetence and dishonesty while demonstrating my own capabilities and leadership potential. The reactions of the executive committee members had been everything I had hoped for. They had been impressed by my analytical work, supportive of my gradual approach to assuming ownership responsibilities, and clearly committed to helping me implement the changes that would improve both employee satisfaction and company performance. Most importantly, they had witnessed firsthand the contrast between Marcus's superficial self-promotion and my genuine expertise, making it impossible for him to continue his pattern of taking credit for work he hadn't done. As I walked back to my desk in the strategic analysis department, I could see that word of the morning's revelation had already begun to spread throughout the office. Several of my colleagues looked up as I passed, their expressions mixing curiosity with something that might have been respect. They had probably heard rumors about what had happened in the executive committee meeting, and they were clearly trying to reconcile the quiet analyst they thought they knew with the owner of the company who had just exposed their manager's incompetence in front of senior leadership. Marcus was nowhere to be seen when I returned to the department, which wasn't particularly surprising given the humiliation he had just experienced. His office door was closed, and I could hear the muffled sound of what might have been a phone conversation through the walls. I suspected he was either frantically trying to explain the situation to his wife, or possibly reaching out to contacts at other firms about potential job opportunities. Either way, it was clear that his comfortable position of authority in the department had been permanently altered by the morning's events. The other analysts in the department seemed uncertain about how to react to the news of my identity revelation. Some of them approached me with congratulations and expressions of support, clearly relieved to learn that the person they had seen being treated unfairly was actually in a position to make changes that would benefit everyone. Others seemed more cautious, perhaps worried about how my new status might affect their own positions, or concerned about appearing too critical of Marcus, now that they knew I had the power to fire him. I tried to reassure my colleagues that my goal was to improve the department's working environment and recognition practices, rather than to seek revenge against Marcus, or to make dramatic changes that would disrupt everyone's work. I explained that I valued the relationships I had built during my time working alongside them, and that I hoped to use my ownership position to address the systemic issues that had been affecting morale and productivity. I emphasized that excellent work should be rewarded regardless of who produced it, and that I was committed to creating an environment where talented people could advance based on their contributions rather than their ability to navigate office politics. The response from my colleagues was overwhelmingly positive, with several people sharing their own stories about projects where their contributions had been minimized or credit had been misassigned. It became clear that Marcus's treatment of me had been part of a broader pattern of poor management that had affected multiple people in the department. Knowing that the owner of the company had experienced these problems firsthand and was committed to addressing them gave everyone hope that real change was possible. Over the next few days, I began to hear more detailed accounts of Marcus's management failures from people who felt safe to speak honestly now that they knew my true position. The stories were remarkably consistent, describing a manager who took credit for subordinate successes while blaming them for his own failures, who assigned important projects based on personal favoritism rather than competence, and who created an environment where talented people felt undervalued and overlooked. The impact on department productivity and employee retention had been significant, with several promising analysts leaving for positions at competing firms over the past year. Armed with this additional information about Marcus's systematic poor performance, I felt even more confident that the changes I was planning to implement would benefit not just me personally but the entire organization. The confrontation during the executive committee meeting had been just the beginning of a longer process of establishing my authority and creating a workplace culture that reflected the values of competence, fairness, and integrity that my grandfather had always emphasized. The following week brought a request from Marcus for a private meeting to discuss what he called moving forward constructively. In light of recent developments, I agreed to meet with him, curious about what approach he would take now that his incompetence had been exposed, and his future at the company was uncertain. The conversation would provide an opportunity to assess whether he was capable of genuine self-reflection and improvement, or whether the changes I needed to make would require replacing him entirely. The meeting was scheduled for Marcus's office, the same space where he had dismissed my contributions and taken credit for my work countless times over the past 18 months. As I prepared for the conversation, I reflected on how dramatically our power dynamic had shifted in just 1 week. The manager who had treated me as an expendable subordinate was now in the position of having to justify his continued employment to the person he had been systematically undermining and exploiting. Walking into Marcus's office the following Tuesday morning felt like stepping into an entirely different universe from the one I had inhabited just 2 weeks earlier. The same mahogany desk sat positioned near the window overlooking the financial district. The same awards and certificates hung on the walls proclaiming his various professional achievements. And the same expensive leather chairs were arranged around the small conference table where he typically held meetings with subordinates. But everything about the atmosphere had fundamentally changed, charged with an electric tension that made even casual conversation feel loaded with unspoken implications. Marcus looked like he had aged several years in the span of a few days. The confident swagger that had characterized his interactions with me for 18 months had been replaced by nervous fidgeting and an inability to maintain steady eye contact. His usual perfectly pressed shirts and precisely knotted ties had given way to slightly wrinkled clothing that suggested he was having trouble sleeping or concentrating on normal routines. Most tellingly, he had positioned himself behind his desk rather than at the conference table, as if the physical barrier might provide some protection from the uncomfortable conversation we both knew was necessary. The formal power dynamic that had governed our relationship for so long had been completely inverted, and Marcus was clearly struggling to adjust to his new reality. For 18 months, he had been the authority figure who could dismiss my contributions, assign me tedious work, and take credit for my insights without consequence. Now he was facing the person who controlled his employment, his stock options, his career advancement opportunities, and his professional reputation within the industry. The manager who had treated me as an expendable subordinate was now in the position of having to justify his continued presence at a company I owned. He began the meeting with what appeared to be a carefully rehearsed speech about moving forward collaboratively and building on the foundation of successful projects we had completed together. His tone was conciliatory but strained, suggesting that he had spent considerable time crafting his words to strike the right balance between acknowledging past mistakes and positioning himself as a valuable team member worth retaining. He spoke about his appreciation for my analytical capabilities and his excitement about working more closely with me on future strategic initiatives now that he understood my background and expertise. The attempt at diplomatic relationship repair was so transparently self-serving that it actually highlighted the insincerity that had characterized his treatment of me all along. Marcus wasn't apologizing because he genuinely regretted his behavior or understood how his actions had affected my professional development and personal well-being. He was apologizing because he had discovered that his victim had the power to retaliate, and he was desperately trying to minimize the consequences of his exposed incompetence and dishonesty. I listened to his prepared remarks without interruption, studying his body language and vocal patterns for signs of genuine remorse versus calculated damage control. What I observed was a man who was primarily concerned with preserving his own position rather than understanding the impact of his actions on others. His apologies focused on misunderstandings and communication failures rather than deliberate choices to undermine and exploit a subordinate. His promises about future collaboration emphasized his continued leadership role rather than acknowledging the need for fundamental changes in how he managed people and projects. When Marcus finished his opening statement, he looked at me expectantly, clearly hoping for some kind of reassurance that his job was secure and that we could return to something resembling our previous working relationship. Instead, I pulled out a folder containing documentation I had been assembling over the past several days, material that would form the foundation for the difficult conversation I had been preparing to have since my identity revelation. "Marcus," I said, keeping my voice calm and professional, "I appreciate your willingness to discuss the situation directly, but I think we need to have a more honest conversation about what's been happening in this department over the past 18 months. I opened the folder and removed several sheets of paper, placing them on his desk where he could see them clearly. These are detailed records of projects where my contributions were minimized or misattributed, along with documentation of feedback from other team members about similar experiences they've had working under your management. I watched the color drain from his face as he recognized what I was showing him. The documents included email chains where he had presented my analysis as his own original thinking, meeting notes where he had taken credit for insights that had emerged from my research, and project summaries where my role had been systematically minimized or omitted entirely. More damaging still were the written accounts from other analysts describing their own experiences with having their work appropriated, or their contributions dismissed by Marcus's management style. The evidence was comprehensive and undeniable, representing a pattern of behavior that went far beyond simple oversight or poor communication. Marcus had been systematically stealing credit from multiple subordinates while simultaneously undermining their confidence and professional development. The Southeast Asia project that had led to my identity revelation wasn't an isolated incident, but rather the most recent example of management practices that had been damaging department morale and productivity for years. Marcus attempted to defend himself by claiming that the situations I was documenting represented misunderstandings about team collaboration and project leadership structures. He suggested that in a fast-paced, analytical environment, individual contributions sometimes got lost in the collective effort to produce high-quality results for clients and senior management. He positioned himself as someone who had been trying to help junior analysts develop their skills by giving them opportunities to contribute to important projects, even if the credit attribution hadn't always been handled perfectly. The defensive explanations were so inadequate and self-serving that they actually made his position worse rather than better. Anyone reading the documentation could see that the pattern of behavior I had identified wasn't the result of poor communication or organizational confusion. It was the systematic exploitation of subordinates by a manager who was willing to build his own career advancement on the foundation of other people's work, while simultaneously preventing those people from receiving the recognition they deserved. I decided to be direct about the implications of what I had discovered. Marcus, the evidence shows that you've been taking credit for work you didn't do while undermining the people who actually produced it. This isn't about misunderstandings or communication problems. This is about deliberate choices you made to advance your own career at the expense of your team members' professional development and recognition. The accusation hung in the air between us, stark and undeniable. I could see Marcus struggling to formulate a response that wouldn't amount to an admission of guilt, while also not appearing to dismiss the seriousness of the situation. His face had gone pale, and small beads of perspiration were forming on his forehead despite the comfortable temperature in his office. The confident, self-assured manager who had dismissed my contributions for 18 months was being forced to confront the reality that his behavior had been documented and would have consequences. Marcus finally attempted a different approach, acknowledging that there might have been some instances where credit attribution could have been handled better, while emphasizing his commitment to improving communication and recognition practices going forward. He spoke about implementing new procedures for project documentation and team collaboration that would ensure everyone's contributions were properly acknowledged. He suggested that we could use this situation as an opportunity to strengthen the department's operations and create a more positive working environment for everyone. The attempt to reframe the conversation around future improvements rather than past failures was tactically smart, but emotionally tone-deaf. Marcus was essentially asking me to ignore 18 months of systematic mistreatment in exchange for promises about better behavior that he had no track record of delivering. He was treating the exposure of his incompetence and dishonesty as a minor setback that could be overcome with some procedural adjustments, rather than as evidence of fundamental character flaws that made him unsuitable for a leadership position. I decided to push the conversation in a direction that would force Marcus to confront the full scope of his failure as a manager. The issue isn't just about credit attribution, I said, leaning forward slightly to emphasize the seriousness of what I was saying. The issue is that you've created an environment where talented people feel undervalued and overlooked, where good work goes unrecognized, and where advancement depends more on your personal favoritism than on actual competence and contribution. I pulled out additional documentation showing turnover rates in our department compared to other areas of the company, along with exit interview feedback from analysts who had left Meridian for positions at competing firms. The pattern was clear and damaging. Our department had significantly higher turnover than comparable areas, and the people leaving consistently cited poor management and lack of recognition as primary factors in their decisions to seek employment elsewhere. Marcus, I continued, you've been losing good people because they don't see a future for themselves in an environment where their contributions aren't valued or acknowledged. The cost to Meridian isn't just the expense of recruiting and training replacements, it's the loss of institutional knowledge, client relationships, and innovative thinking that comes from having a stable team of engaged employees. The financial impact of Marcus's poor management was something that resonated more powerfully than abstract concerns about fairness or employee satisfaction. As a business owner, I could quantify the cost of his leadership failures in terms of recruitment expenses, training investments, and lost productivity during transition periods. The turnover in our department had cost Meridian approximately $300,000 over the past 18 months, not including the opportunity costs associated with delayed projects and reduced analytical capacity during staffing transitions. Marcus looked genuinely surprised by the turnover data, suggesting that he had been so focused on managing upward toward senior executives that he hadn't paid attention to the downstream consequences of his behavior. He asked several questions about the exit interview feedback, apparently unaware that multiple departing employees had specifically cited his management style as a primary factor in their decisions to leave the company. The disconnect between his self-perception as an effective leader and the reality of his impact on department performance was striking. I decided to share one particularly damaging piece of feedback from Jennifer Martinez, a talented analyst who had left 6 months earlier for a position at Goldman Sachs. In her exit interview, Jennifer had described feeling invisible and undervalued, despite consistently producing high-quality work that contributed significantly to client recommendations and portfolio performance. She had specifically mentioned instances where Marcus had presented her research to senior management without acknowledging her contributions, and she had noted that advancement opportunities seemed to depend more on personal relationships with Marcus than on demonstrated competence and results. Jennifer's feedback was particularly powerful because she had been one of our department's top performers, someone whose departure had created both analytical gaps and client relationship challenges that we were still working to address. Her decision to leave Meridian for a competitor represented exactly the kind of talent loss that could undermine our long-term competitive position if it continued unchecked. More importantly for Marcus, Jennifer's specific criticism of his management practices provided concrete evidence that his behavior was driving away exactly the kind of high-performing employees that any successful department needed to retain. The revelation about Jennifer's exit interview feedback seemed to hit Marcus harder than anything else I had shared during our conversation. He had apparently viewed her departure as a natural result of competitive recruiting rather than as a reflection of management failures within our own department. Learning that she had left specifically because of his treatment of her work and contributions forced him to confront the possibility that other departures might have been similarly preventable with better leadership practices. Marcus asked whether other departing employees had provided similar feedback, and I confirmed that the pattern was consistent across multiple exit interviews. Talented analysts were leaving not because they were dissatisfied with their compensation or benefits, but because they felt their contributions weren't valued and their career development wasn't being supported by departmental leadership. The problem wasn't external competition for talent, it was internal management practices that made good employees feel like they had no future at Meridian. At this point in our conversation, Marcus seemed to genuinely grasp the seriousness of the situation for the first time. The defensive posturing and self-justification gave way to something that might have been actual remorse, though I remained skeptical about whether his reaction was driven by genuine understanding or simply by recognition that his job was in jeopardy. He asked what he could do to address the problems I had identified and whether there was an opportunity for him to rebuild his credibility as a department leader. The question of whether Marcus could be rehabilitated as a manager was one I had been considering carefully since my identity revelation. On one hand, replacing him would require a significant investment in recruiting and training a new department head, along with the inevitable disruption that would accompany any leadership transition. On the other hand, His pattern of behavior suggested deep-seated character issues that might not be easily corrected through additional training or supervision. I decided to be direct about the challenges he would face in trying to rebuild trust and credibility with his team. Marcus, the people in this department have watched you take credit for their work while simultaneously undermining their confidence and career development. Even if you change your behavior going forward, it's going to take time for people to believe that the change is genuine, rather than just a response to pressure from senior management. I explained that rebuilding trust would require more than procedural changes or promises about future behavior. It would require Marcus to acknowledge specifically what he had done wrong, to apologize directly to the people he had harmed, and to demonstrate through sustained action that he had genuinely learned from his mistakes. Most importantly, it would require him to actively advocate for his team members' recognition and advancement, rather than continuing to view them as competition for senior management attention. The conversation had reached a crucial decision point, where Marcus would need to choose between genuine self-reflection and continued defensive rationalization. I could see him processing the information I had shared, and weighing his options for responding to what was essentially an ultimatum about his future at the company. His next words would reveal whether he was capable of the kind of honest self-assessment that would be necessary for any rehabilitation effort to succeed. Marcus took several minutes to respond, staring out the window at the San Francisco skyline while apparently wrestling with the implications of everything I had told him. When he finally spoke, his voice was quieter and less confident than I had ever heard it during our 18 months of working together. He acknowledged that he had made serious mistakes in how he had managed the department and treated individual team members. He admitted that his focus on building his own reputation and advancing his own career had led him to minimize other people's contributions in ways that were unfair and counterproductive. The admission was more honest than I had expected, though I remained cautious about interpreting it as evidence of genuine change rather than strategic damage control. Marcus continued by asking specific questions about what he would need to do to rebuild credibility with the team and restore effective functioning to the department. He wanted to understand not just the procedural changes that would be required, but the deeper cultural and behavioral modifications that would be necessary to create an environment where talented people wanted to stay and develop their careers. I outlined several specific steps that would be necessary for any rehabilitation effort to have credibility. First, Marcus would need to acknowledge his past mistakes directly to the people who had been affected by them, not in a general way, but with specific recognition of how his actions had harmed their professional development and recognition. Second, he would need to implement transparent processes for project assignment and credit attribution that would prevent future misunderstandings about individual contributions. Third, he would need to actively advocate for his team members' advancement opportunities, rather than viewing their success as competition for his own career growth. Most importantly, I explained, Marcus would need to demonstrate through sustained behavioral change that he genuinely understood why his previous management approach had been problematic. This would require him to shift from viewing himself as the star performer who occasionally drew on team support, to seeing himself as a leader whose job was to develop and showcase other people's talents. The transition would be difficult and would require ongoing supervision and feedback to ensure that old patterns didn't reassert themselves under pressure. Marcus listened carefully to my explanation of what rehabilitation would entail, asking thoughtful questions about timelines and accountability measures. He seemed to understand that he was being offered an opportunity for redemption rather than simply being dismissed immediately. But he also seemed to grasp that the opportunity came with significant conditions and requirements. His job security would depend not just on avoiding future mistakes, but on actively demonstrating the kind of leadership behaviors that would rebuild trust and improve department performance. The conversation had lasted nearly 2 hours by this point, and I could see that Marcus was emotionally and mentally exhausted by the process of confronting his failures and considering what genuine change would require. I decided to bring the meeting to a conclusion while giving him time to process what we had discussed and formulate his response to the choice I was offering him. Marcus, I said, standing up and gathering my documentation, I want you to take some time to think about whether you're genuinely committed to making the changes we've discussed, This isn't about saying the right words or implementing some surface-level procedural modifications. This is about fundamentally changing how you approach leadership and team management in ways that might be uncomfortable and challenging for you personally. I explained that I would be meeting individually with other team members over the next week to get their perspectives on department operations and their thoughts about what changes would be most beneficial for both productivity and morale. Their feedback would help inform my decisions about leadership structure and personnel changes going forward. Marcus would have an opportunity to begin demonstrating changed behavior immediately, but he should understand that his team members would be watching carefully, and that their trust would need to be earned rather than assumed. As I prepared to leave his office, Marcus asked one final question that seemed to reveal genuine uncertainty about his future at the company. He wanted to know whether I had already decided to replace him and was simply going through the motions of offering rehabilitation, or whether I was genuinely open to the possibility that he could become an effective leader if he made the necessary changes. The question deserved an honest answer, and I took a moment to consider how to respond in a way that would be both truthful and constructive. Marcus, I said, I believe people can change if they're genuinely motivated to do so, and if they're willing to do the hard work that change requires. Whether you can become the kind of leader this department needs remains to be seen, but I'm willing to give you the opportunity to prove that you can learn from your mistakes and grow into the role you've been occupying. I added that my decision would ultimately be based on what was best for the department, the company, and the employees whose careers and professional development were at stake. If Marcus could demonstrate genuine change and rebuild trust with his team, then keeping him in a leadership role might be the most effective approach. If he couldn't or wouldn't make the necessary changes, then replacing him would become necessary regardless of the short-term disruption it might cause. The remainder of that week was marked by a palpable tension throughout the strategic analysis department, as word of my conversation with Marcus spread through informal networks and speculation about potential changes filled casual conversations. I could see my colleagues watching both Marcus and me carefully, trying to gauge what might happen next and how any leadership changes might affect their own positions and career prospects. The atmosphere was charged with anticipation and uncertainty, though most people seemed cautiously optimistic about the possibility of positive changes in how the department operated. Marcus's behavior during the week following our meeting was notably different from his typical management style. He was more deferential in his interactions with team members, more careful about credit attribution in emails and meetings, and more inclusive in his decision-making processes. The changes were obvious enough that several people commented on them, though there was widespread skepticism about whether the modifications represented genuine transformation or simply strategic adaptation to changed circumstances. I spent the week conducting the individual meetings I had promised, sitting down with each member of the strategic analysis team to get their perspectives on department operations and their thoughts about what changes would be most beneficial. The conversations were revealing in ways that went beyond what I had learned during my informal information gathering over the previous months. When people knew they were speaking to someone with the authority to make changes, they were much more specific about problems they had observed and much more direct about recommendations for improvement. The feedback about Marcus was remarkably consistent across different team members. Everyone acknowledged that he was intelligent and capable of producing good analytical work when he focused on tasks rather than politics. However, everyone also had specific examples of instances where their contributions had been minimized, their ideas had been appropriated, or their professional development had been hindered by his management approach. The pattern of behavior I had experienced personally was clearly part of a broader systematic problem that had affected virtually everyone in the department. Several team members shared stories that were even more egregious than what I had experienced personally. Tom Richardson, one of our senior analysts, described a situation where Marcus had presented Tom's entire portfolio optimization model to a major client as his own original work, leading to a consulting contract that provided Marcus with significant bonus compensation, while Tom received no recognition or financial benefit. Lisa Park, another experienced analyst, recounted multiple instances where Marcus had interrupted her during client presentations to explain her own research findings, effectively positioning himself as the expert who was translating her technical work for business audiences. The individual conversations also revealed the extent to which Marcus's poor management had affected department culture and teamwork. People were reluctant to share innovative ideas during team meetings because they had learned that Marcus was likely to present those ideas as his own in other contexts. Collaboration between team members had decreased because everyone was focused on protecting their individual contributions rather than working together to produce the best possible results. The competitive, zero-sum environment that Marcus had created was undermining exactly the kind of collective problem-solving and knowledge-sharing that made analytical teams most effective. Perhaps most significantly, the conversations revealed that several of our most talented analysts were actively considering leaving Meridian for positions at other firms. The combination of poor management, limited advancement opportunities, and lack of recognition for their contributions had convinced them that their career development would be better served elsewhere. Losing these people would be devastating for the department's analytical capabilities and client relationships, representing exactly the kind of talent hemorrhaging that could undermine our competitive position in the market. By Friday afternoon, I had completed all of the individual team meetings and had gathered comprehensive feedback about both specific problems and potential solutions. The information confirmed and expanded on what I had already learned about Marcus's management failures, while also providing insights into systemic issues that went beyond any individual manager's behavior. The challenge would be determining whether the problems could be addressed through personnel changes and procedural modifications, or whether more fundamental structural reforms would be necessary to create the kind of high-performing, collaborative environment that the department needed to succeed. That evening, I sat in my apartment reviewing the notes from all of my team conversations and weighing the various options for moving forward. The evidence about Marcus's poor management was overwhelming and undeniable, but the question of how to address it remained complex. Replacing him immediately would send a strong signal about my commitment to creating a better working environment, but it would also create short-term disruption during a period when we had several important client projects in development. Giving him an opportunity to demonstrate changed behavior would avoid immediate disruption, but carried the risk that old patterns might reassert themselves once the pressure of scrutiny decreased. The decision I ultimately reached was influenced by a comment that Jennifer Martinez had made during her exit interview 6 months earlier. She had noted that one of the most frustrating aspects of working under Marcus wasn't just his treatment of her individual contributions, but his creation of an environment where talented people felt like they had to choose between being collaborative team members and protecting their own professional interests. The zero-sum dynamic he had fostered was exactly the opposite of what analytical teams needed to produce innovative solutions and maintain competitive advantages. As I prepared for what I knew would be a decisive conversation with Marcus the following Monday, I reflected on the broader lessons that the situation had taught me about leadership, organizational culture, and the responsibility that came with ownership authority. My 18 months of working anonymously had provided invaluable insights into how companies actually operated when the owner wasn't watching, but it had also shown me the cost of allowing poor management to continue unchecked when I had the power to address it immediately. The upcoming week would determine whether Marcus was capable of genuine change, or whether replacing him would be necessary to create the kind of department culture that honored my grandfather's values and supported the career development of talented employees. Either way, my period of passive observation was ending, and my active leadership of Meridian Financial Services was about to begin in earnest. Monday morning arrived with an unseasonably cold wind whipping through San Francisco's financial district, and I could feel the weight of decisive action settling on my shoulders as I prepared for what would likely be Marcus's final evaluation. Over the weekend, I had received an urgent call from James Morrison informing me that 2 more analysts had submitted resignation letters, citing better opportunities elsewhere but privately expressing frustration with department leadership to their colleagues. The talent drain that had been simmering for months was accelerating into a crisis that demanded immediate intervention. The resignation letters had come from Alex Thompson and Nina Patel, both rising stars in the department, whose analytical work had consistently exceeded expectations and whose client relationships had generated significant revenue for Meridian. Alex's departure was particularly damaging because he had been leading our renewable energy investment analysis, a rapidly growing sector that represented millions in potential client assets. Nina's resignation created gaps in our cryptocurrency and blockchain research capabilities at exactly the moment when institutional clients were demanding sophisticated guidance in these emerging markets. More troubling than the immediate operational impact was the message these departures sent about the department's trajectory under Marcus's continued leadership. Both analysts were leaving for lateral positions at competing firms, suggesting that their decisions were driven by factors other than compensation or advancement opportunities. When talented people chose to restart their careers elsewhere rather than continue developing within an established organization, it indicated fundamental problems with leadership culture that couldn't be solved through incremental adjustments or procedural reforms. I had spent Sunday evening reviewing Marcus's behavior during the week following our confrontational meeting, looking for evidence of genuine change versus superficial modifications designed to buy time and preserve his position. The analysis was deeply disappointing. While Marcus had been more careful about explicit credit theft and had made token efforts to include team members in decision-making processes, the underlying attitudes and patterns that had created the department's toxic culture remained fundamentally unchanged. The most telling incident had occurred during a client presentation on Thursday, when Marcus had systematically undermined Lisa Park's expertise while she was explaining currency hedging strategies to a major institutional investor. Rather than allowing Lisa to demonstrate her knowledge and build credibility with the client, Marcus had interrupted repeatedly to provide additional context and clarification, effectively positioning himself as the senior expert who was supervising her work. The behavior was technically collaborative rather than openly antagonistic, but it served the same function as his previous tactics by diminishing Lisa's professional standing and reinforcing his own authority. Several team members had approached me informally during the week to express skepticism about Marcus's apparent behavioral changes, noting that his modifications seemed calculated and temporary rather than representing genuine transformation. Tom Richardson had observed that Marcus was being more careful about taking explicit credit for other people's ideas, but was still structuring team meetings and client interactions in ways that highlighted his own contributions, while minimizing everyone else's impact. The consensus among the analytical staff was that Marcus was adapting tactically to changed circumstances, without addressing the fundamental character issues that had made him a problematic leader. My decision about Marcus's future had crystallized during a conversation with Patricia Williams on Friday afternoon, when she had asked pointedly about my plans for addressing the management issues that had been exposed during the executive committee meeting. Patricia had noted that the company's reputation for developing analytical talent was being damaged by the turnover in our department, and that clients were beginning to ask questions about continuity and expertise when their primary contacts left for competing firms. The conversation with Patricia had made clear that my personal feelings about Marcus's treatment of me were secondary to broader organizational concerns about performance, retention, and competitive positioning. As the majority shareholder of Meridian Financial Services, my responsibility was to make decisions that served the company's long-term interests, rather than seeking personal vindication or giving problematic employees additional chances to prove themselves. Marcus had been given ample opportunity to demonstrate effective leadership over the course of several years, and the evidence overwhelmingly suggested that he was incapable of creating the kind of collaborative, high-performing environment that the department needed to succeed. When I walked into Marcus's office that Monday morning, I could see immediately that he understood the seriousness of the conversation we were about to have. He had dressed more formally than usual, wearing what appeared to be his most expensive suit, and a tie that projected authority and competence. His desk had been cleared of the usual clutter, and he had arranged our seating at the conference table rather than positioning himself behind his desk in a defensive posture. The careful staging suggested that he viewed this meeting as his final opportunity to preserve his position at the company. Marcus began with what was clearly a prepared statement about the steps he had taken during the previous week to address the management issues we had discussed. He spoke about implementing new procedures for project documentation and team communication, about scheduling regular one-on-one meetings with team members to provide coaching and support, and about developing more transparent processes for performance evaluation and advancement recommendations. His presentation was polished and comprehensive, touching on all of the areas where I had identified problems with his leadership approach. The problem with Marcus's reform proposal was that it focused entirely on procedural modifications, while ignoring the fundamental trust and credibility issues that had resulted from years of poor behavior. He was essentially asking me to believe that the systematic exploitation and undermining I had documented could be resolved through better meeting schedules and clearer documentation requirements, The approach revealed a profound misunderstanding of both the scope of the problems he had created and the depth of organizational change that would be necessary to address them effectively. I listened to his entire presentation without interruption, taking notes on his specific commitments and timelines, while observing his body language and vocal patterns for signs of genuine conviction versus rehearsed performance. What I saw was a man who was intellectually aware that his behavior had been problematic, but who lacked the emotional understanding necessary to comprehend why his actions had been harmful, or what genuine change would require. His focus remained primarily on preserving his own position, rather than on rebuilding trust with the people he had damaged through years of systematic mistreatment. When Marcus finished his presentation, he looked at me expectantly, clearly hoping for some indication that his reform proposals had been sufficient to secure his continued employment. Instead, I reached into my briefcase and removed a folder containing the resignation letters from Alex Thompson and Nina Patel, along with additional documentation about the department's deteriorating performance metrics and client satisfaction scores. Marcus, I said, sliding the resignation letters across the table, 2 more of our top analysts submitted these over the weekend. Both cited better opportunities elsewhere, but their private comments to colleagues made clear that management issues were the primary factor in their decisions to leave Meridian. I watched his face pale as he read through the resignation letters, both of which were professionally worded but devastating in their implications for the department's future capabilities. Alex's letter noted his appreciation for the analytical experience he had gained, but mentioned his desire to work in an environment where his contributions would be more fully recognized and supported. Nina's letter was even more pointed, referencing her excitement about joining a team where collaborative leadership and professional development were prioritized. The departure of Alex and Nina represents a loss of approximately $4 million in annual client revenue, I continued, along with specialized expertise in sectors where Meridian needs to maintain competitive positioning. More importantly, their decisions to leave suggest that the fundamental problems in this department are accelerating rather than improving under your continued leadership. Marcus attempted to argue that the resignations might have been motivated by factors unrelated to his management, such as compensation disparities or advancement opportunities that Meridian couldn't match. He suggested that turnover was a natural part of the financial services industry, and that losing some team members didn't necessarily indicate systematic leadership failures. The defensive rationalizations were predictable, but revealed his continued inability to accept responsibility for the consequences of his behavior. I decided to address his deflections directly by sharing additional information about exit interviews and employee feedback that had been gathered over the weekend. Both Alex and Nina had participated in extended conversations with human resources, during which they had provided specific examples of management practices that had influenced their decisions to seek employment elsewhere. Their feedback corroborated everything I had learned during my individual meetings with team members, painting a comprehensive picture of leadership dysfunction that went far beyond isolated incidents or personality conflicts. Alex had specifically mentioned the renewable energy project where Marcus had presented his research findings to senior management without acknowledging his contributions, leading to a situation where Alex's expertise was invisible to the executives who made decisions about project assignments and advancement opportunities. Nina had described feeling professionally stagnant because Marcus's management style prevented her from building direct relationships with clients or developing the kind of senior-level visibility that was essential for career progression in the financial services industry. The documentation from their exit interviews was particularly damaging because it demonstrated that Marcus's problematic behavior had continued even after my identity revelation and our subsequent confrontational meeting. Rather than serving as a wake-up call that prompted genuine self-reflection and behavioral change, the exposure of his incompetence had simply made him more careful about covering his tracks while continuing to undermine his team members in subtler ways. "Marcus," I said, leaning forward to emphasize the seriousness of what I was about to tell him, "the evidence is overwhelming that your management approach is driving away exactly the kind of talented people that Meridian needs to maintain its competitive position. The procedural changes you've proposed might prevent some of the most egregious examples of credit theft, but they don't address the underlying attitudes and behaviors that have created a toxic environment where good people feel undervalued and overlooked." I explained that effective leadership in an analytical environment required more than just avoiding obvious mistakes or implementing better documentation procedures. It required the ability to identify and develop talent, to create opportunities for team members to showcase their capabilities, and to build organizational cultures where collaboration and innovation could flourish. Marcus's track record suggested that he lacked the emotional intelligence and interpersonal skills necessary to excel in these areas, regardless of how many procedural reforms he might implement. The conversation had reached the point where I needed to be direct about my decision regarding his future at Meridian. I had given him multiple opportunities to demonstrate genuine change and had provided clear feedback about what would be required for him to rebuild credibility as a department leader. His response had been to propose superficial modifications while continuing the same underlying patterns of behavior that had created the problems in the first place. "Marcus," I said, keeping my voice calm but firm, "I've made the decision to restructure the strategic analysis department with new leadership. Your position as department director will be eliminated effective immediately, though I'm prepared to offer you a senior analyst role if you're interested in remaining with the company in a non-management capacity." The words hung in the air between us, final and irreversible. I watched as the full implications of what I had said registered on Marcus's face, transforming his expression from hopeful expectation to shocked disbelief to something that might have been panic. The confident, self-assured manager who had dismissed my contributions for 18 months was confronting the end of his authority and the dramatic reduction in his professional status that would accompany a demotion to individual contributor. Marcus's initial response was to argue that my decision was premature and that the department improvements he had outlined would address the retention and performance issues I had identified. He claimed that replacing him would create unnecessary disruption during a critical period when several major client projects were in development, and that his institutional knowledge and client relationships made him too valuable to remove from a leadership position. The arguments were desperate and self-serving, but they also revealed his fundamental misunderstanding of his own value to the organization. I decided to address his claims about his indispensability directly by sharing information about client satisfaction scores and project performance metrics that had been tracked over the past year. The data showed that projects led by Marcus consistently received lower client ratings than those managed by other department heads, and that his client relationships were characterized by higher turnover and lower asset retention than industry averages. Rather than being an irreplaceable asset, Marcus was actually performing below organizational standards in virtually every measurable category of leadership effectiveness. The client satisfaction data was particularly devastating because it contradicted Marcus's perception of himself as a skilled relationship manager and strategic thinker. His ability to present well in initial meetings and proposal presentations had masked ongoing problems with project execution and client service that had been slowly eroding Meridian's reputation in key market segments. Several major clients had specifically requested that future projects be managed by other team leaders, though Marcus had apparently been unaware of these preferences. Marcus attempted one final argument for preserving his leadership position, claiming that the timing of his removal would send negative signals to both employees and clients about organizational stability. He suggested that a gradual transition process might be more appropriate, allowing him to train his replacement while maintaining continuity in client relationships and project management. The proposal was tactically clever but ignored the reality that his continued presence in a leadership role would perpetuate exactly the problems that had necessitated his removal in the first place. I explained that the decision to remove him immediately was based on the accelerating pace of talent loss and the urgent need to signal to remaining team members that fundamental changes were coming to the department's culture and management practices. Every day that Marcus remained in a position of authority was another day that talented analysts might decide their futures lay elsewhere, and another opportunity for his management failures to cause additional damage to both employee morale and client relationships. The offer to remain with Meridian as a senior analyst was genuine and reflected my recognition that Marcus did possess technical skills that could be valuable in a non-leadership capacity. His analytical capabilities were adequate, and his industry knowledge could contribute to project success if properly supervised and integrated into a collaborative team environment. However, his response to the offer would reveal whether he was capable of accepting responsibility for his failures and rebuilding his professional reputation through excellent individual contribution. Marcus asked for time to consider the analyst position, noting that the significant reduction in compensation and status would require him to discuss the decision with his family and evaluate his options in the broader job market. I agreed to give him through the end of the week to make his decision, while making clear that the leadership transition would begin immediately regardless of whether he chose to remain with the company in a different capacity. The remainder of our meeting focused on practical arrangements for the transition, including the transfer of ongoing projects to other team leaders, and the communication strategy for announcing the departmental restructuring to both employees and clients. Marcus was cooperative during this portion of the conversation, perhaps recognizing that his professional reputation would be better served by facilitating a smooth transition rather than creating additional problems during his final days in a leadership role. As I prepared to leave his office, Marcus made one final attempt to explain his perspective on the events that had led to his removal. He acknowledged that he had made mistakes in managing individual team members, and that his focus on building his own career had sometimes come at the expense of recognizing other people's contributions. However, he maintained that his intentions had been positive, and that he had been trying to build a successful department that would benefit everyone involved. The partial acknowledgement of responsibility was more than I had expected from someone who had spent years deflecting blame and minimizing his own mistakes. However, it also revealed the limited nature of Marcus's self-awareness and his continued inability to understand the full scope of the damage his behavior had caused. His characterization of systematic credit theft and employee undermining as simple mistakes suggested that he still didn't grasp the ethical dimensions of his leadership failures, or the profound impact they had had on people's careers and professional development. When I left Marcus's office for the final time as his subordinate, I felt a complex mixture of relief, sadness, and determination. Relief that the confrontation was over and that I could begin implementing the changes necessary to rebuild the department's culture and performance. Sadness that the situation had deteriorated to the point where removing Marcus was the only viable option for protecting both the organization and the people who worked within it. And determination to ensure that the leadership transition would serve as the foundation for creating the kind of collaborative, high-performing environment that honored my grandfather's values and supported the career development of talented employees. The news of Marcus's removal spread quickly through the strategic analysis department, generating reactions that ranged from surprised relief to cautious optimism about what changes might follow. Several team members approached me privately to express their appreciation for addressing the management problems that had been affecting department morale and performance for years. Others seemed uncertain about what the leadership transition would mean for their own positions and career prospects, particularly given the unusual circumstances surrounding my identity revelation and assumption of active ownership responsibilities. The week following Marcus's removal was marked by intensive planning sessions with James Morrison and other senior executives about the restructuring of the strategic analysis department and the recruitment process for identifying new leadership. We discussed both internal promotion possibilities and external candidate searches, weighing the advantages of institutional knowledge against the benefits of bringing in fresh perspectives and proven leadership experience from other organizations. The decision we ultimately reached was to promote Lisa Park to interim department head while conducting a comprehensive search for permanent leadership. Lisa had demonstrated exceptional analytical skills and had earned the respect of her colleagues through years of collaborative and supportive behavior. More importantly, her experience working under Marcus's problematic management had given her clear insights into what needed to change and how to create a more positive environment for team development and performance. 3 months later, I stood in the same conference room where my identity had been revealed, but everything about the atmosphere had fundamentally transformed. The quarterly department review meeting was filled with energy and enthusiasm that had been absent for years, as team members presented their latest analytical findings with confidence and pride. Lisa Park had exceeded all expectations as interim department head, creating an environment where talented people felt valued and supported, while maintaining the analytical rigor that Meridian's clients demanded. The turnaround had been remarkable in both speed and scope. Within weeks of Marcus's removal, the exodus of talented analysts had stopped completely, replaced by a renewed sense of purpose and collaboration that rippled through every aspect of the department's operations. Tom Richardson had withdrawn his informal resignation notice and committed to leading our expanded cryptocurrency research division. Several analysts who had been considering external opportunities decided to stay and pursue advancement within Meridian's more supportive leadership structure. Marcus had ultimately chosen to decline the senior analyst position I had offered, instead accepting a director-level role at a smaller investment firm, where his management style might be less problematic in a different organizational context. His departure had been professional and cordial, though I suspected he never fully understood the extent to which his behavior had damaged both individual careers and overall department performance. The transition had been smoother than anticipated, largely because Lisa's collaborative approach had made it easy for team members to shift their loyalty and support to new leadership. The most significant transformation had been in the department's culture around recognition and advancement. Lisa had implemented transparent processes for project assignment and credit attribution, ensuring that excellent work was consistently acknowledged and that career development opportunities were distributed based on merit rather than political favoritism. The changes had unleashed a wave of innovation and productivity that had impressed both clients and senior executives, validating my decision to prioritize long-term organizational health over short-term stability. Our client satisfaction scores had improved dramatically, with several major accounts specifically commenting on the enhanced quality of analytical work and the improved responsiveness of project teams. The renewable energy portfolio that Alex Thompson had been developing before his resignation had been successfully completed by a collaborative team effort that showcased multiple analysts' expertise while delivering insights that led to significant investment returns for our clients. The success demonstrated what was possible when talented people were properly supported and recognized for their contributions. Perhaps most gratifying was the feedback I received from team members about the changes in their daily work experience. People described feeling more engaged and motivated, more willing to share innovative ideas during team meetings, and more confident about their prospects for career advancement within Meridian. The competitive zero-sum environment that Marcus had fostered had been replaced by genuine collaboration and mutual support that made everyone more effective at their individual responsibilities. The industry recognition had followed quickly behind the internal improvements. Our department's research on emerging market opportunities had been featured in several prestigious financial publications, with individual analysts receiving byline credit for their specialized expertise. Lisa Park had been invited to speak at the annual Financial Services Innovation Conference about leadership practices that fostered analytical excellence. The external validation reinforced the positive changes while raising Meridian's profile within the competitive landscape of financial services firms. My own role within the company had evolved naturally from anonymous analyst to active owner and strategic leader. The experience of working within the organization had provided invaluable insights into both operational challenges and cultural dynamics that would have been impossible to gain from traditional executive positions. I had developed genuine relationships with employees at all levels and had earned credibility through demonstrated competence rather than inherited authority. The board of directors had formally appointed me as Chief Strategic Officer, a newly created position that reflected my unique combination of analytical expertise and ownership perspective. The role allowed me to maintain direct involvement in research and client work, while also taking responsibility for long-term strategic planning and organizational development. It felt like the natural culmination of my grandfather's vision for combining rigorous analysis with principled leadership. James Morrison had announced his intention to transition into an advisory role over the next 2 years, preparing for my eventual assumption of the Chief Executive Officer position when I felt ready for the broader responsibilities of running the entire organization. The succession planning process was being handled carefully and transparently, ensuring that all stakeholders understood the continuity of leadership philosophy while acknowledging the fresh perspectives I would bring to the role. The financial performance of the Strategic Analysis Department had exceeded all projections, with revenue growth of 35% over the 3 months since Marcus's departure. The improvement reflected both improved client satisfaction and increased efficiency in project delivery, as teams focused their energy on analytical excellence rather than internal politics and credit protection. The success had attracted attention from institutional investors who were considering increasing their asset allocations managed by Meridian. During quiet moments, I often reflected on the lessons learned from my 18 months of anonymous observation and the dramatic confrontation that had reshaped my understanding of leadership and organizational responsibility. The experience had taught me that passive observation, while valuable for gathering information, could become complicit with harmful behavior if it continued when intervention was possible. True leadership required the courage to act decisively when fundamental values were being violated, regardless of short-term disruption or personal discomfort. The transformation of Meridian's Strategic Analysis Department had become a case study within the company, for how addressing cultural problems could unleash dramatic improvements in both employee satisfaction and business performance. Other department heads had requested consultations about implementing similar transparency and recognition practices, spreading the positive changes throughout the organization. The ripple effects suggested that my grandfather's values were being embedded more deeply into company culture than had been possible through policy statements or management directives alone. Looking ahead, I felt confident that Meridian Financial Services was positioned for sustained growth and success based on a foundation of analytical excellence and principled leadership. The company my grandfather had built was stronger and more competitive than it had been in years, staffed by talented people who felt valued and supported in their professional development. Most importantly, it had become the kind of organization where competence was rewarded, integrity was expected, and excellence was achieved through collaboration rather than exploitation. The quarterly review meeting concluded with presentations of several innovative analytical projects that would never have been possible under Marcus's leadership, involving creative collaboration between team members with complementary expertise and genuine enthusiasm for pushing the boundaries of financial analysis. As I listened to the passionate discussions about market opportunities and research methodologies, I realized that the confrontation with incompetent management had been just the beginning of a much larger transformation that honored both my grandfather's legacy and my own vision for what financial services leadership could accomplish. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.